It's great to hear your voices in the room. Good to see you. Welcome to Grace, especially you students who are in here worshiping with us. Love having you here. We got like a little choir section down here, mostly students right behind me. Drowns out my voice, but I hear their voices. It is the best, actually. It's a perfect setup for my corporate singing talents. I don't have to hear myself, and I get to hear the voices of the saints singing to God. Great to see you. Good to be here. If you have your Bible, you can open it to Luke chapter 10. We'll pick up in those same sacred words that we sang, that we read together. If you don't have a Bible, you can slip up your hand. We'll put a Bible in your hand. Also, first Sunday of the month, we'll be celebrating communion at the end of the sermon time. And so you can get one of those communion element packets if you didn't get one already. And there's always the Grace Notes sheet. Down at the bottom is a connection card. If you're new here, or if you have prayer requests, or both, actually. If you're new and you have prayer requests, please just fill that out. And then you can tear off that bottom section and drop it in the offering boxes on either side of the room, also in the foyer. We pray for those every single week. And if you have tithes and offerings that you'd like to give to God, you can drop those in the boxes as well. There's ways to give online. You can find all that information on the Grace Notes sheet. Before we get into our sermon, a couple of quick announcements. First, Easter is less than a month away, a huge day to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus. And we have a little bit of a new schedule for Easter Sunday morning. We anticipate that there will be many of us gathering to worship, more than we can fit in two gatherings. And so this is the schedule. 7 a.m. we will be outside in the amphitheater, sunrise celebration, worshiping God and thanking him for the power of the resurrection. However, we are going to move our baptisms. Every Easter we celebrate baptisms. It's a great time, and sometimes we've done those outside. This year we're actually going to do them in the midst of our main gatherings, and so we're going to have the tubs down here in the front. Yeah, it won't be. Yeah, there's a lot of good reasons to do that. And really, baptism is that way of publicly saying to your community, your congregation, as for me, I trust Jesus. I'm laying down my old life, and I'm trusting the power of God to give me new life in Christ. And so we're just really excited to be able to celebrate those all together across three gatherings: 8:15, 9:45, 11:15. And here is just a thing that would be helpful to us. We anticipate the 9:45 would maybe be the fullest gathering. So if you are able to come to worship at 8:15 or 11:15, you'll probably be more likely to get a great spot in this space. And if you go online, you can follow that QR code on the slide, or you can go to gracesnellville.com/Easter. You can simply let us know which time you plan to attend, because we might be totally surprised. Maybe there's going to be 2,000 of you who show up at 11:15, in which case we're going to need a few more chairs at that time. And so that would be super helpful for us as we're planning about a month from now for the celebration of Easter. If you just let us know when you're coming. The second thing I want to highlight is just in a couple of weeks, on Sunday, March 17th at 10:30 a.m., we are going to gather for an information session for foster care. That's in the trail, which is in those learning cottages. Don't say trailers, they're learning cottages right over there. And so that's usually where our second and third graders meet. And I know Jeremy, along with his wife Andrea, they shared last week. Kristen, we've got an amazing team here at Grace who really serves the foster care community well. And through the years, it's been a big part of our heart for the next generation to be able to come alongside kids in need and families in need and help them as much as we can. And so if you feel any tug on your heart, doesn't mean you're signing up to a foster family, although maybe that's the case. If you have any tug on your heart to engage with this, that info session is a perfect opportunity. We have ways that you can come alongside families who are fostering, ways for you to help meet basic needs for families, both within our church and beyond, and also ways to open your own home to be a foster parent or foster family. So really, really good stuff. Now, to our scripture, Luke chapter 10. And this morning, I want to do a little bit of zooming out, kind of overview of this overall passage and kind of what it means for us as a church. And then in the second half of the sermon, we'll zero in on kind of a specific aspect of it. How do we love our neighbors really well? And so I'm going to just kind of take it verse by verse. Luke 10, verse 25, we just read it all together in our liturgy, but we're going to stick with it because it just can't read this and learn this enough. On one occasion, verse 25, an expert in the law, which means a theologian, stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he asked, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" "What is written in the law?" Jesus replied. "And how do you read it?" And this question from Jesus is so helpful, so good. I mean, whenever anyone asks you a deep question about life, is it okay to live with my girlfriend or my boyfriend before we get married? How should I respond to someone in my family who has really hurt me? How old should my kids be before they get a smartphone? Like these deep questions about life, Jesus' reply is very helpful. Well, what's written in the law and how do you read it? When we encounter these deep questions of life, one of the best things we can possibly do is ask the same question Jesus asked. What's written and how do you read it? When somebody asks you those questions, just say, well, what have you found in the Bible? How do you read the scripture? And if they say, well, I don't know the Bible, or I haven't read the Bible, okay, great, well then let's look at some stuff. If they say, well, these are the passages, it's great, let's chew on those. I mean, it's just brilliant what Jesus does here. And some of you might still be thinking about that smartphone example. It's like, well, there's nothing written in here about iPhones. And that's true, iPhones came out just a little bit after the time of Jesus. But even though the Bible predates smartphones, the Bible does not predate temptation, screen addiction, wisdom. In fact, Solomon wrote a whole bunch of proverbs about wise ways to raise our kids that could apply really well to that question about smartphones. How old should they be before they get one and everything like that? And so when we come across all these questions, these deep questions about life, Jesus' reply is so good. What's written? How do you read it? It's like one of our commitments as a community that when we wrestle with the deep questions of life, one of our first things is to say, well, what is written and how do we read it? And this theologian, this expert in the law, verse 27, answered, well, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. It's a good answer. It's a very good answer. It is the most important command of the Old Testament from Deuteronomy chapter 6 about loving God, joined to another command from the Old Testament, Leviticus chapter 19, about loving your neighbor. And this simple response, love God and love your neighbor, is a bit of a framework for growth and for transformation. And what I mean by that is, I think we have a sense that if we're here, we are equipping one another to follow Jesus well into the neighborhoods, nations, the next generation. That's our mission as a local church. But what does it really mean? And how are we following Jesus well? What kind of transformation, what kind of life are we aiming at? And this verse gives us a framework to understand that. We've looked at this the last few weeks, loving God, heart, mind, strength, and relationships. Part of being transformed in our relationship with God through Jesus means that our hearts are renewed, no longer deceitful, but trustworthy. And then as that work of God, the Spirit of God in our hearts, radiates outward through our whole person, it means that our soul, which is our whole sense of ourselves, our identity, becomes more and more rooted in God. And that our bodies, which are like our power packs, the battery that kind of runs things in many ways, and that our bodies, our strength, would be directed more and more in godly ways and less toward the fleshy stuff that draws us away from God and from life. And that our minds would be transformed, our thoughts, how we know and think and believe, that all of that would be pure and righteous and good. And that following Jesus well means loving God as a whole person, all of our heart, all of our soul, all of our strength, all of our mind. And any idea of discipleship that fails to take into consideration the wholeness of the person is really an incomplete vision for discipleship. All that, loving God, heart, soul, mind, and strength, the dimensions of a person, and our relationships, loving our neighbor as ourself. I want to zoom out for just a moment. As a local church, if you've been around Grace Snellville for any period of time, you know our mission is to equip one another to follow Jesus well into the neighborhoods, nations, and the next generation. And for 40 years, that has been our heartbeat, discipleship. The great commission of Jesus. After the resurrection, he's with his disciples. He says, all authority has been given to me on heaven and on earth. I've got all the authority. Great. You guys go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded. Discipleship. Discipleship. Making disciples in our neighborhoods with the people around us, helping them follow Jesus well. Making disciples among the nations, which over these last 10 to 20 years have seen such a beautiful tapestry of humanity in our Gwinnett demographics. People from all over the world. That nations are not just, something way over there, some overseas thing, but like we are the nations, making disciples among the nations. And of course, the next generation. How do we help those coming behind us to learn to follow Jesus really, really well? And so out of all of this passage here, we've put together a very simple 4x4 answer, or maybe framework is a better word, marks of a disciple who follows Jesus well. It means that we're growing in wholeness of heart, soul, strength, and mind as we love God. And as we'll see in this parable of the Good Samaritan, the way we relate to other people, the way we love those who are around us, we really see them for who they are. And then we move toward them, serve and walk with them. It's really basic. It's really simple. Love God and love your neighbor. It's so simple that my kids can understand it, which is important. And yet is deep enough that I've walked with God for a long time, and these categories still offer very rich challenge for my continued growth. And the last thing to say about it is how easy it is to emphasize one side or the other. Some people get so focused on loving God and getting everything right in the belief categories about God that they fail to see how to love their neighbors. And other people are so drawn toward loving their neighbors and social action and justice that they lose sight of what's true about God. But here at Grace, we're people unapologetically committed to both because Jesus said it's both. And so when we train, if we're doing classes or we think about what are we teaching with our students in True North or Lug or Kids Life or Grace Kids? This is the core of it, that all of our training and discipleship efforts would be deepening the love of God and the love of our neighbors in these areas. That when we go out to make disciples, we engage and embrace the task of the Great Commission. The point there is that people would come to know God for who he is, and they would love God because he is the ultimately worthy subject of our love, object of our love. And of course, that they would love their neighbors. When we gather in our tables, in our communities, in our homes, just the organic stuff of life, that everybody who comes and sits at our table would have an opportunity to see the beauty of God and experience the love of God as we love our neighbors. And when we worship here, when we come all together week to week, that we open the Word, We read it, we hear what it says, and it draws us into that loving God and loving neighbor. Like, that's really the basic stuff of our discipleship, what it means to follow Jesus well. And the way Jesus responds in verse 28 to the lawyer, the religious leader's response, is so profound. In verse 28, he says, "You have answered correctly. Do this and you will live." Now, there are two other major discussions where Jesus talks about love God and love your neighbor. And over in Matthew, the way he talks about it is, this is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is just like it. Okay, so it's obviously very important to love God and love neighbor. Jesus says this is the number one priority. Over in Mark, in that conversation, he says, there's no commandment greater than these. Okay, we get it, Lord. It's very important. But what he says in Luke, it just pierces my heart. He says to the man, if you do this, if you love God and love your neighbor, you will live. And he doesn't mean you will live after you die only. He means you will start living now and it will extend into eternity. Like, this is the essence of life. And we live in a world where people are desperately searching for life. They're trying to figure out their hearts. I have friends who are counselors and therapists, and like, in the world these days, it's really hard to get an appointment because so many people are trying to figure out what's going on in their hearts. I mean, not just talking about church people, just people in general, like therapy, mental health, it's all over right now. People are trying to piece together their souls into an identity that makes sense. And so they offer up these contributions to the world, their activities, their perspectives, their viewpoints, in a cry for affirmation of their identity. I mean, the world is searching for soul life, heart life. The world is trying to figure out how to manage the body, our strength. So there's so much focus on, managing the body. What kind of food are we going to eat? What's going to be healthy? What kind of medication and supplements? What kind of exercise? What kind of sleep? Like, people are trying to figure out their bodies. And on the flip side, people don't always know what to do with all the desires and stuff going on physically with their bodies. And so they often put their bodies to misuse, addiction, drinking. Sometimes people try to find life just by distraction in the world of social media and endless doom scrolling, all of this. It's interesting. A couple of years ago, I had a conversation with this doctor. We were at some event together. She's a Muslim lady, and she had seen people through the pandemic and then afterwards in Texas. And I asked her, in the aftermath of the pandemic, had she seen any patterns with people's health? And she said, yeah, at the hospital, we're getting all these people with organ failure. I was like, what's that about? And she said, well, so many people were so isolated during the pandemic, they just started drinking and it became habitual, and a lot of organ failure, just a huge increase of alcohol-induced organ failure. And I was like, that is super depressing. And it's people trying to manage heart, soul, mind, and strength, trying to find life. But the source, the way they're going after it, is killing them, literally. Here's what Jesus says: loving God and loving your neighbor is life. This is where you find life. You will live, Jesus says. That is wild. Verse 29 says, the man wanted to justify himself, and so he asked Jesus, who is my neighbor? Have you ever had someone challenge you or ask you a question in such a way that it hits a little close to home, and you're like, I don't really want to talk about that right now, Sometimes after leading a meeting, a work meeting or something, somebody will come up to me and ask me, why did you respond that way at that point in the meeting? And seeking to justify myself, I'll give all the answers about why I responded the way I did, because it's a little bit defensive. Or if maybe you have a loved one that suggests you spend a little bit too much time on the phone. Seeking, it's like something Amy would be like, what's going on your phone? Like it's a family time and I'm like in my phone and she'll be like, what are you doing on your phone? Seeking to justify myself. It's a work text. I'm not checking the scores of the Milwaukee Bucks as I switch apps. Seeking to justify himself. I know there are all kinds of theological overtones to the word justify, and we could explore all of those, but at a very basic level, this guy gives the right answer. Yeah, loving God and loving neighbor is the way to live, but he kind of isn't fully convinced, maybe. Seeking to justify himself, he asks, who is my neighbor? And what he means there is that he wants Jesus to tell him that the life he's living right now is good enough. It's great, you got it. Good job. Go on your way. And so Jesus responds to this man by inviting him and his imagination to a desolate road that goes from the high hills of Jerusalem down to the low places of Jericho. This man, verse 29, wanting to justify himself, asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? And in reply, Jesus said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. This is a picture of that road. You can see that the hills are pretty desolate. And it was known in the ancient times as a place where you were vulnerable, you're at risk. There were many robbers. So this story, even though it's a parable, it's fiction, has plenty of connections to truth. It's plausible. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road. And the priests were the religious leaders who had a responsibility to take care of the people. When he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. As far away as he could, he moved away from the guy. Verse 32, so also a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was. And when he saw him, he took pity on him. And he went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. Look after him, he said, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have. And which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? And the expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. And Jesus told him, go and do likewise. Jesus here flips the story. The man asks, who is my neighbor? How big do I have to draw the circle of people I actually love? And Jesus says, how do you become the kind of person who loves his neighbor the way this Samaritan loves and serves the man on the side of the road? Not so much about trying to draw the boundary of people you have to love, but more so, Jesus says, becoming the kind of person that when you see someone in need, you have the vitality and the spiritual resources to be able to step into that need in a way that demonstrates the love of God. And of course, the first thing the Samaritan does is simply see the man. He sees him on the side of the road. He sees him. And Jeremy preached such a beautiful sermon last week about Jesus being the example of the way we can see people the way God sees people. Out of Mark chapter 5, Jeremy preached that amazing story. Jesus is on his way urgently to help this little girl who's dying, 12 years old. And yet, as he's going, there's a woman who's been bleeding. She grabs his robe and is healed, almost like by accident. It says Jesus' power just went out from Jesus. It wasn't like it was a whole conversation. And when Jesus felt that, he stopped and he turned to her and he saw her and there's a conversation. And then he went on and they found that the little girl had died and Jesus raises her from the dead. I mean, crazy story. But Jeremy pointed out that there is a pace to Jesus' life. And when we move at that kind of pace, we can actually see people for who they are. And when we see people, it opens opportunities for power to move. The great enemy to seeing people is hurry. We get into a hurry. We forget that all this time belongs to God, and he's made plenty of time for us to do what he wants us to do. Now, we add plenty of things onto the list that are not necessarily God assignments, and that's what makes us constantly hurried. The priest and the Levite, they see the man, and they make a calculation. Not worth it. Maybe it was fear. And I know that there is some fear even in our community in the aftermath of the news last week that there was a stabbing at Brookwood High School. I don't know the people involved personally. I saw the updates, probably like many of you saw the updates as well. But when you see something like that come through, it can create fear. Just like this on the road, right? You've got a man who is walking and he gets beaten and robbed, and then you're walking on that same road and you're like, uh-oh. I mean, if I stop and help this guy, if I step into this situation, maybe they'll catch me, maybe they'll rob me, maybe I'll be beaten. The threat of violence looms over this whole Jericho road. And so the priest and the Levite, they make a calculation. They see him and they say, I'm going to move away to the other side of the road. What is it about the Samaritan that when he sees the need, he's willing to move toward that guy and step into, not away from, but step into what seems to be a fearful and intimidating place with mercy and compassion and service? Because that is really what Jesus is talking about here, becoming the kind of person that even when you're walking on a fearful road, you don't move away from people in need, but you actually step in because somehow you're tapped into the power of God. And so you don't have fear. As we apply this story of moving toward in our own lives, thinking about how we grow as disciples, loving God, heart, soul, strength, mind, loving neighbors, seeing people, and moving toward them, I want us to consider two questions. First, just think about who you are moving toward in life right now. The most basic definition of a neighbor is someone who is near. It comes from the Old English, nigh and bur. So nigh, we still use that every once in a while, like that old-timey language. The end is nigh. The end is near. It just means near. It'd be really weird if like somebody, you're driving with the family in the car and it's like lunchtime and everybody's like, you check your phone, it's like, I'm going to look to see if there's a Chick-fil-A nigh. Like, that would be kind of weird. But that's the same idea, near. And then bur meant peasant in like Middle English. And so neighbor, nigh, bur, meant like the closest peasant. And there's a very real sense in which the word neighbor just means the people who are near to us. Loving our neighbors might begin by taking inventory, taking stock. You could, if you have a piece of paper, if you're taking notes, or maybe you got little notebook on your phone, or maybe it's an exercise to do later, but you could just begin making a little list of the people who are near to you in life. Probably that starts with family, or the people you live with, those who you spend the most time with. 2, 3, 4, 5 people right there in that closest circle. Then you could think beyond that super close circle. You got your friend groups, your classmates, your co-workers, sort of another little bit wider orbit of life, and then a few other names. And just think about the neighbors in your life, the people who live around you are probably in a second or third kind of ring from you. And at a certain point, you could just kind of look and say, okay, there's a lot of people here. Statistically, they say it's very hard to keep track of or have a relationship with more than like 100 or 150 people. I'm not saying you have to write down all that many names, but just start in the middle and just kind of work your way out there. Who right now is near to you in your life? And then think about what is your vector relative to them. Remember, that's like the idea of moving toward or moving away. It's a direction, it's a velocity. If you remember your classes from school, vectors are awesome until you're tested on them, and then they can really wear you out. But how are you moving toward people? Are you moving away from any of those people? Are you moving toward any of those people? Are there barriers that would prevent you? I mean, could be on some of that closest circle of people in your life. You know, there's like 2 or 3 arrows, like, yeah, my heart is open, I'm moving toward those people. But then there's that one person that actually I'm married to, and there's a big barrier between me and that person. You know, I mean, it's like you just like kind of pay attention. Who are you moving toward? And who are you moving away from? Because that's one of the big dynamics in this parable. The priest and the Levite and the Samaritan are all walking the same road. Samaritan moves toward the need of his neighbor. The priest and Levite move away. And it's good to be specific. The reason I'm encouraging you to write actual names down is because we love and show love toward people, specifically and individually. Sometimes when we think about loving neighbor, we can very quickly move toward like big global groups of people. But the Samaritan did not see the guy on the side of the road and say, you know what, I'm going to start a nonprofit for every victim of robberies. He served this guy. There's nothing wrong with starting a nonprofit to help victims of robberies, but the point is that love is always demonstrated personally and specifically. To really love our neighbor means to love people, a neighbor, not a general concept or a general idea. And that's where we can get in trouble, because sometimes we get this idea that loving our neighbors means loving everybody. You realize that's God's job. God is the only being with the capacity to demonstrate perfect, infinite love for everybody. He's the only one with the resources to be able to specifically love everybody. God does not call you or me to love everybody. He calls us to be open to loving anybody, but not to feel responsible for loving everybody. That's God's job. That's not ours. Our response to God is to love into the places where he calls us and where he leads us. And oftentimes that means looking at the people around us, figuring out what direction are we moving relative to them. Are we moving in a direction of love, or are we moving a direction far away? One of the other things that is troubling and can happen on those scattergraph kind of maps is that you could find that 3 or 4 circles out from your core group of people, like there's a lot of movement of love out there, but not much movement with those closest to you. I don't know if there's much worse than somebody who seems to really love everybody out there, but there's no love in the home. This is one of the great dangers, and I talk to people who grew up, pastors' kids, children of those who are in ministry and things like that, and it's like, yeah, my mom or my dad, like they served the ministry and they loved everybody, but the house was like a love desert. And it's really those are convicting stories for me personally. And I think, Lord, help me to love my kids and my wife, those closest to me, most deeply. And then from there, however you lead me. Who are you loving? Where are you moving? Who are you moving toward? Who are you moving away from? And the second question, and this is always the challenging one, why are you moving in the direction that you're moving? This gets down into the motivation. Because there are times when we move toward people because circumstance brings us together. Or both the same activity or the same sport or whatever. Like there are these seasons where we kind of walk the road together because of circumstances, not necessarily love. That circumstance creates a nearness in which love could blossom and service and kindness, but sometimes we just move toward people because that's the circumstance of life. Similarly, sometimes we move away from people because that's the circumstance of life. They move away, something like that. That sort of happens. But why? Why are we moving the direction that we're moving in relative to these people? For the Levite and the priest, they're coming down the road, and we don't know precisely why they move away. Could be fear, could be inconvenience, could be religious reasons, A priest and a Levite would have known the law, and if you get too close to a dead person or a Gentile, then you're ceremonially unclean. So it could have been I don't know the ethnicity of that guy over there, and he might be dead, so that's like a double reason not to contaminate myself. We have all kinds of reasons we move away from people. They hurt us. We harbor bitterness. There's a break in a relationship. So many reasons why that vector can move away. And not every reason to move toward people is a great reason. I remember when I was in college, I started off my freshman year, and I met all the guys on the baseball team, and they were super cool. They were way cooler than I had ever been. In high school, I was good at baseball, but I was mostly a nerd, and I don't know that I really had I wasn't one of the cool kids in high school. So then I get to college, and it's what? All of the coolest guys are my teammates? These are all the cool kids? This is amazing. And so I moved toward them. But the reason I moved toward them was for affirmation. I wanted them to look at me and think I was cool too. Didn't take them long to figure out I was kind of a nerd also. But they accepted me. It was great. But it took me several years before I really began to see my teammates as people to really love and serve, and not just people I wanted their approval and wanted them to think I was cool. Does that make sense? You can move toward people for reasons that aren't great. You move away from people for reasons that aren't great. But here's what happens with the Samaritan. This is so amazing to me. It says when the Samaritan saw the guy on the side of the road, he took pity on him. Now some translations say he felt compassion. Literally the Greek word there is he felt his guts twist. He felt his guts, he felt it in his guts. He saw the guy and something twisted in his gut. Now, before the biblical text, people were speaking and using Greek. There are all sorts of Greek documents and things, records that we have that were written by people who weren't into Jesus or God or anything. They're just, Greek writers. And that word there, that kind of twist in your guts word, was really a pretty coarse word. It wasn't anything to do with compassion or mercy or pity. It was just kind of, they used that word, but it was more for indigestion. And then Jesus shows up on the scene, and this word suddenly takes on a new meaning. This word, this twisting of your guts, in the whole Bible only applies to describe Jesus or when Jesus uses it. It's interesting. To describe Jesus, this word talks about when Jesus would look at the crowds, like Mark 6 or Mark 8, they're out and he's been teaching and healing, They don't have any food. The food trucks aren't nearby. Jesus is like, when he looks at the crowd, that word, he feels it in his gut. He has compassion on them. Multiple healings. When he heals the leper, it says he looks at the guy and he feels that. The man whose son has epilepsy, he feels that. It's like this word that before the time of Jesus just meant like something happened in your guts. Suddenly now with Jesus, there's this new sense of inward compassion that didn't previously exist. And then when Jesus would tell parables, like here, he'd use it to describe the sense of what happened inside of the people who live in a kingdom way. So Matthew 18, there's a parable of a guy. He's a king, and he's got this other guy who owes him tons and tons of money. And the guy begs and begs, please forgive my debt. It says the king looks at the guy who owes him money and feels it in his gut and releases the debt. Or the very famous parable of the prodigal son, where there's a father and a son, and the son takes the money, he goes way off and spends all the money in loose living. And when he comes back, it says the father in the parable sees the son and feels it in his gut, has that same compassion. This is where that word is used. And it's limited usage, the way that it shows up, only to describe Jesus' own inner life or these parable figures, these characters in these parables doing stuff the kingdom way, suggests that this kind of compassion felt by the Samaritan, felt by the father, felt by the king who forgives the debt, is not just your run-of-the-mill pity or I feel bad for this person, but it's actually something that comes from God's own heart. That when the Samaritan saw the guy on the side of the road, there was something that happened that actually was sparked in the very compassion of God. Why are you moving in the direction that you're moving toward people? And Jesus is holding out the possibility. He's holding out the vision for becoming the kind of neighbor who can trust his gut, who can trust her gut. The kind of person who is tapped into God to the extent that when you walk down the dangerous road of life and there's a robbery over here and somebody's beaten over there and there's a stabbing here, when you're walking down that road, what's happening inside of you is tapped in to God's own compassion. So that you see people, you realize you cannot love and serve and pour oil and wine and walk with every single person on the planet. But you're like connected to God in a way. You love God, you know God, you have God's spirit within your heart living. You're walking along and there's something that happens where you can trust your gut. Literally, that compassion of God wells up within you and motivates you to move toward them. And this kind of compassion from God, it's not a performance, it's not duty, it is actually God's love working through you into the life of another person. This kind of love is powerful. I mean, think about what happens with the Samaritan here. He's moved by this kind of compassion, and this kind of compassion just like it's like a tidal wave just washing away all these barriers that would be reasons to keep the Samaritan from approaching this guy on the side of the road. We've already talked about the fear factor. That's an easy, obvious barrier. But there are ethnic problems between the Samaritans and whatever this guy is. I mean, probably we presume in the story that the guy on the side of the road is a Jewish person. And so the Samaritans and Jews have no dealings with each other. There's all kinds of ethnic hostility. Like we don't really interact. Everybody kind of knows we're going to keep our distance ethnically. We maybe can coexist a little bit. Just don't come into our area. We'll not come into your area. Sometimes we have to walk the same road, but we're going to keep our distance. And that love of God, compassion, just washes that away. There's an economic gap. The Samaritan in the story has a beast of burden, oil, wine, money, time. I mean, the Samaritan in the story is pretty well off compared to this guy who's just gotten everything taken. He is penniless. I don't know if you ever since those economic gaps. But like, if you are poor and you are around somebody who's wealthy, it's pretty easy to see a barrier or boundary between your life and that person's. If you have a lot and you're around somebody who has a little, it's pretty easy to see a barrier between you and that person. Oh, it's going to be a dependency relationship. What about this? I don't want to blah, blah, blah. Big economic barriers. When that love of God, that compassion of Christ rises up, washes that barrier away. Ethnic, economic, political. If you read about the political relationship between the Jews and the Samaritans, it was worse than like left and right in America. It was bad. They did not like each other. They didn't want to go near each other. That barrier washed away. Religious, huge conflict. And it ties in with the other issues too, but the Jews and the Samaritans fought intensely. Terrorist acts, hated each other for the religions that they practiced, even though they called on the same God, the way they said they did it and where they did it and how they did it. Religious conflict. And so you have these huge barriers or boundaries that would separate the Samaritan from this guy on the side of the road. And yet when the compassion of God rises up within this guy, all of those things are washed away. That's how powerful this kind of gut compassion from God is. And this is what happens. It not only washes away the barriers, it also unleashes all kinds of resources. And so we mentioned, and we'll talk about it next week, but this guy, he gives what he has. Resources are flowing. How is that even possible? This guy's on a journey. Why would he give all this stuff up? Well, if he's tapped into God, the source, who is the one who provides all needs, if he understands that he's actually sharing in the never-ending love of God, then resources are easy to release because you're living in a life of abundance. If you're not tapped into God, if you don't know God's love, if you're kind of scarcity mindset and you come across a need, you're kind of like, what can I spare? This guy has the love of God welling up in his heart, that Christ-like kind of love, open-handed with his resources. What kind of neighbor are you? Who are you moving toward, and why are you moving in that direction? And when we become this kind of neighbor, we don't have to justify ourselves. All we have to do is receive God's love and extend that love to our neighbors. Now, I read this parable, and on the one hand, I'm so inspired. Like, yes, I would love to be like the Samaritan. On the other hand, I don't have the time, I don't have the resources, there's too many barriers. I don't know if you feel that way. Seeking to justify himself, the preacher decided to lower the bar of the parable for all of the people. I mean, it's such a compelling vision for a neighbor, and it's so challenging. And so how do we respond? As we mentioned, it's Communion Sunday, and I'll invite David up and the band, and David's actually going to lead us through the taking of the elements. But to set it up, there's this moment in the Psalms where King David, not David Walker, our worship leader, but King David, that other David, he messes up. He does not love his neighbor well at all. He commits adultery with Bathsheba and then conspires to have her husband killed. Like, this is the opposite of the Good Samaritan. He blows it. And yet, we see that he comes back to God and seeks God's forgiveness. In Psalm 51, he confesses, God, I've gone astray. And then he utters a very simple prayer. Lord, but I need you to create in me a pure heart and renew a steadfast spirit in me. Like, Lord, I need new guts. I need new heart. I need new soul. Like, Lord, I need you to heal. And the beautiful, beautiful thing is that Jesus is God's answer to David's prayer. That Jesus, with that love of God, crossed all the boundaries and barriers that separate him from us, our sin and everything else. Like that love just washes all that away. And he comes toward us, and that love releases resources from the kingdom of heaven, of forgiveness and grace and everything else we need to be restored. And so as you hold these elements, I want you to just contemplate and consider for a moment. Jesus' body broken, that's what he said the night before he was crucified, that's the bread. And Jesus' blood poured out for you for the forgiveness of sins. Just consider these. And David's going to lead us in that simple prayer that David prayed from Psalm 51. And then he's going to invite us to eat and to drink, because we cannot love our neighbors until we know the love of God.
Thanks for watching this Grace Snellville video. We want to help you get connected to everything happening around the Grace Snellville community. We want to pray with you, and we want to help equip you to follow Jesus well. Would you just take a moment, even now, to go to our website at gracesnellville.com. We hope to see you soon.